All right, hello everyone. Hope you're doing well as we get closer and closer to the end of our semester. Our plan for today, we're going to go over the group activities from last class really fast. Just a quick note, group number 5, I wasn't able to open the file that you sent me, so if you could just send it again in a different format, maybe as a PDF or something like that, that would be helpful. And don't worry, I won't be penalized or anything, but I just couldn't open the file you sent me. Also, I still need to send, I think I got about 3 groups done with those, so I'll try to get the rest of them done during my office hours. What we'll try to do, so we'll go over that group activity today, and then we're going to start working our way pretty seriously through the last thing that we're going to discuss, the various sort of cognitive, social, psychological biases that can interfere with inquiry, and use this as a way of sort of just reminding ourselves almost why we're talking about any of this logic stuff in the first place. What's the point of this class? Why should we care about any of it? That'll be sort of the goal for today. My guess is we'll either start doing a group activity on Monday, or maybe we might even need to wait till Wednesday. But and then we should have all of next Friday to do exam review. That's what I'm expecting the rest of the semester to look like. Anyone have any questions or comments or thoughts on anything before we get started? All right, then let's just begin by going over the group activity from last time. So hopefully that is up and everyone is successfully seeing it. So the people's reasoning looked pretty good. The most common thing I noticed is that people sometimes needed to just say a little bit more. They weren't answering all of the parts of the question. So let's just go through some of these questions, go over some examples. So question number 1, right? So your topic, your sort of task in all of these is you have to first identify the sample group of the total population. People who really clearly do this tend to do a better job just actually with their logic. Their logic just tends to be better. Same thing by making the sampling method really explicit. The more explicit you make it, the better I've noticed people's analyses of whether or not the argument is successful or not tend to be. So let's just start here. So Wall Street Journal of 1,000 adults found that 53% believe Medicare was fine the way that it is, and it only needs minor adjustment. The 1,000 adults that were surveyed were Wall Street Journal subscribers who responded to a request for responses that were published in one issue of the paper. So let's identify the sample group. Sample group is 1,000 self-responders, or 1,000 adult self-responders. The population is presumably all adult Americans, something like that. All right, and what was the sampling method? Right. So the poll relied, or the sample group relied upon voluntary responses, right? Because it's people who chose to actually respond. So we have voluntary responses from people who read a particular issue of the Wall Street Journal. Right. So because it's voluntary responses, it's not exactly a random sample. It's another thing that's just important to note. Right. And certainly not a stratified random sample. Now, in and of itself, that's not a reason to dismiss the argument, right? Using the randomness and especially stratified randomness, that's sort of the best practices. But as we've said, that's not always possible. Number 2 is going to be better, and even there, it's still not going to utilize true randomness, right? So what matters is there any sort of problem with the way this sort of group is concerned? What are going to be the misleading factors? What members of the population are less likely to be represented, and how serious is that going to be in this case? And I would say that in this case, this is a pretty bad inductive generalization. And you maybe even go so far as to say that it commits the fallacy. It's not as bad. 3 definitely commits the fallacy. 1 is close. So you might even say that it commits the fallacy of bias statistics. And so why? What's misleading here? What's going to be sort of overlooked? The only people who subscribe to the Wall Street Journal are included in the poll. And not just subscribe to the print edition, right? Actually do it to the print edition of the paper. And the population that's likely to do so is going to be older, and probably wealthier than the average population. And this by a pretty fair margin, right? I mean, I don't know. Let's do a quick opinion poll. Does a single one of you subscribe to the Wall Street Journal's print edition? Is there a single person here who does? No one's at least saying so. Anyway, so that's a relatively narrow population, one that we suspect will be have pretty different properties with regard to whether or not people are going to feel negatively or positively about Medicare. One thing that's not a problem, it's probably not an especially big problem that this sort of call was only put out in one issue of the journal. Presumably that does exclude certain people. Presumably everyone who subscribes to the Wall Street Journal doesn't subscribe to, that might miss an issue here or there. But that presumably is not really going to matter demographically. That's not going to exclude sort of systematically people who are busy one day and didn't read it. Probably that's not going to systematically exclude anyone on a demographic level. All right. So this would be a good sort of example of the sort of answer that I'm looking for on something like an exam. Did anyone have any questions on this first problem? All right, I'll go a little bit faster through the next ones. Not the right board. I just wanted to go through the first one in a little bit of detail. So the second one, very similar problem. Again, a poll from the Wall Street Journal about the same topic. Here we have slightly different groups. So we have the sample group are responders from random emails and phone calls. And we don't know exactly how many of them. So there still is a kind of self-response here, and indeed there will always be a self-response, unfortunately, unless you're going to hold people at gunpoint unless they answer your opinion poll. You're always sort of in a sense going to be dependent upon sort of self-response, but at least now the people who are sort of being asked to self-respond are random in some sense, which is a different from in the first case. The overall population is the same, presumably all adult Americans. Sampling method from the responders, stratified random sampling techniques were used to weigh the responses. Based on the national demographics. And so as a result, at the very least, we can say that this argument is quite a bit stronger than the last one. We don't know exactly how many people responded. That's not included. 3,000 adults were sort of sent surveys. We don't know how many responded to the survey. And indeed, there will always be some weaknesses in really any survey you look at. None's going to be perfect. And the weakness in this one, we don't know exactly how many people actually responded. But the fact that stratified techniques were used is useful. because if they're done correctly, you can actually get away with a lot smaller of a population than you otherwise wouldn't need. So even if not that many people actually responded, there's still reason to think that this survey is giving us some useful information. All right. This third one is hopefully you all thought was the sort of worst, right? So what is the sample group in this case? Sample group is 96 actor and athlete owned restaurants. The overall population is all new restaurants or all restaurants. You could, either way of putting it's probably fine. All restaurants were new restaurants at some point, so either way you put it, it's okay. The sampling method that was employed, what was it? Well, basically they just picked the people running the poll picked 96 restaurants. There's no randomness in how these people were picked. It's even indeed probably worse than what was going on in number one. At least in number one, there's some randomness just predicated in the people who randomly happen to respond to the request. Here, the people running the polls specifically said that restaurant, that restaurant, that restaurant. All right, and so as a result, this is a rather bad inductive generalization. And it definitely commits the fallacy. It's not even on the borderline in this case. This is a clear, obvious instance of the fallacy. Why? Because actor and athlete-owned restaurants are likely to be very, very different than other restaurants with regard to how well they do. And in particular, they have these kinds of restaurants will have advantages that other restaurants will not have, and so they'll be far more likely to stay in business than the average new restaurant. And so as a result of committing the fallacy, we just have no reason to sort of trust this 20% number. This 20% number simply is not especially relevant to all restaurants. It was not properly arrived at. All right, so how are we doing so far? This first three, okay? All right, good. Then let's just finish up with the remaining ones. And people did pretty well in the remaining ones, so I'll go quickly here again. Which of these is the stronger? The only difference between the two arguments is the level of the margin of error. So the larger the margin of error, the stronger the argument is. So A has the larger margin of error, so therefore A is the stronger argument. It might still be less useful, because of the additional sort of wiggle room. We can't make as precise predictions on the basis of it, but nevertheless, the conclusion is still more likely to be true. And that's ultimately what we're evaluating when we're evaluating arguments. How likely is the conclusion to be true? And the last one, so I ask you to sort of rethink through the hasty generalization fallacy, a fallacy from earlier in the semester, on the basis of what we've been talking about. So here, the problem with this sort of small sample group, the reason why the sample group is too small is because it can't possibly represent the overall population. So the sample group in this case, 3 people who brought cars from one location. Okay. Can't possibly represent all Subaru cars. They come from the same place, which potentially makes the statistics sort of biased. And also, 3 cars just isn't enough to actually take into account all the variabilities that can go into how well there's too high of a chance of just getting a bad luck with the car. Right? And how many cars would you have to look at? That's not clear. It depends on the sampling method, right? If you're only looking at cars from this one used car dealership, probably it doesn't even matter how many you get. It's still not going to be representative. But on the other hand, if you get a few from this car dealership, a few from a couple other car dealerships, maybe, I don't know, maybe 100 starts giving us useful information. Maybe 1,000 starts giving us useful information. Again, we'd have to do math to calculate exactly how large it would need to be. But 3 is definitely not large enough. There's just too high of a risk of getting just a really random, unlucky result if you're only looking at 3 cars. All right. So that's going through that group activity. Again, does anyone have any questions or want to go over any of the problems from that group activity? Or maybe from the homework either that was due today? All right. And from what I can see, it mostly looks like people are doing a pretty good job from the ones that I graded so far, at least. So yeah, I'm not super concerned about how you all are doing with these inductive generalizations. Mainly the people who didn't score well just needed to write more or say a little bit more. Their reasoning was still basically correct. They just weren't going into enough detail. So, all right, then let's start turning to chapter 11. Let's go to the last new stuff from the semester. So we began talking about chapter 11 a little bit on Wednesday, but we really just did some big picture overview stuff. So let's just begin with that big picture overview stuff, refresh your memory there, and then we'll start getting into the specifics. So what we're looking at in this class, the reason we're studying logic in the first place is because we presumably want to engage in this process of inquiry. We want to investigate things in order to arrive at what's true or false. And okay, why do we want to do that, right? Maybe we don't want to discover what's true or false. Lots of people don't seem to especially care. So what's the sort of stakes here? Why are inquiries important and necessary? Well, actually, okay, let's make it really vivid, right? I mean, in the time of a global pandemic, you want the medical advice that you are following to be the result of careful inquiry. Right? You want the evidence that you're following to be based on solid reasons, solid evidence, because if you get it wrong, right? If you make receive bad medical advice or follow bad medical advice, there are real stakes to that, right? You could become sick, you could poison yourself, you could do this, that, the other thing, right? The stakes are high. As a result, what matters is getting it right, right? And so when you're trying to get it right, you want your beliefs to be based on evidence, right? On reasons, right? And reasons and evidence. This could mean, in the case of, again, a global pandemic, this could mean studies, or it could mean expert testimony, in the example of a reason. Right? Whatever it is, we want to formulate our beliefs about what's true on the basis of reasons and evidence, so that our beliefs are more reliable, more trustworthy, we're more likely to get it right, especially when getting it right really matters. So we're talking a little bit about rational beliefs, and I want to define what I mean by this a little bit more precisely. So a rational belief is a belief that you hold on the basis of good reasons or evidence, right? You believe that something is true because that's what the evidence suggests. Now, there's lots of things you believe that you probably have never even thought about why you believe it. And it might well not be on the basis of good reasons or evidence, right? The example that I always use that I hope is at least sort of funny, right? When I was 5, my dad told me that dragonflies would sew your lips shut, so I'm still a little bit scared of a dragonfly every time I see him, right? That is indeed not an especially rationally formed belief, right? It's not formed on the basis of good reasons or evidence. My dad was pretty obviously playing a joke on me, so I should not. But nevertheless, I still believe it. It's not rational because it's not held on the basis of evidence. Right? People often critique, like politicians, for example, or people get critiqued a lot for changing their minds on topics. But actually, depending on why you're changing your mind, at least, it can be more rational to change your mind than to be steadfast in your beliefs. Right? If your belief is rationally formed, if you believe what you believe because of evidence, if the evidence changes, so should your belief. Right? And one thing we're going to talk about a little bit later in the context of this, rationally formed beliefs are therefore all what we're going to call falsifiable. They're all beliefs that in principle, something could change your mind about because the evidence could change or the reasons could change. And then your belief would change too. Lots of other things go into our beliefs and how we form beliefs besides just the presence, of reasons and evidence. There's sort of psychological factors, emotional factors, social factors, cognitive factors. We'll talk about all of these in various details as we go that are involved in how we form beliefs too. And this isn't a problem. I mean, this is just part and parcel of how we form beliefs. It's not a bad thing per se. It becomes a bad thing if these other factors get in the way of our ability to actually engage in an inquiry. And sometimes they will. And again, it's not other people, it's us. All of us are subject to these sort of various kinds of pressures. And so we'll need to be wary of them, both in other people, but also in ourselves as things that can interfere with an inquiry. Because not every time you discuss something, you're actually not necessarily engaging in an inquiry. An inquiry has a very specific goal. The goal has to be to discover what's actually true. It can't be anything else. It can't be to make yourself feel good about something. The goal can't be to win an argument. The goal can't be to make a lot of money, right? If it's an inquiry, the only goal of the inquiry is truth, figuring out what's actually true. These other factors that are involved, they can sometimes distort that goal. They can make us sort of think that what we're doing is pursuing truth when we're really doing something else. And that's when these other factors become problems. We're going to call it, when these other things do indeed become problems, we're going to call these biases. Right? Things that hinder our ability to successfully carry out an inquiry or a dialogue, and a dialogue is just where you inquire with other people. So sort of group inquiry. Right. So all that's just a little bit of review from last class. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions or comments from any of that? All right, then let's keep moving on. So to have a good inquiry, there are sort of two basic attitudes. The book calls these the spirit of inquiry that people sort of need to possess. And these attitudes, while I think most people would say these attitudes are admirable, they're hard, right? And again, they're not hard for just other people, they're hard for me, they're hard for everyone, right? It's always a challenge to sort of maintain these attitudes because other things are at play. So what are these attitudes? First thing, there's a need for sort of what we're going to call open-mindedness. And open-mindedness pertains to the possibility that what you already believe could be false. And that's why we're engaging in the inquiry, precisely. To be open-minded is to be willing to engage seriously with this possibility. Now, if what we're inquiring into is what restaurant we should go to, yeah, you're probably going to be, it's fine, right? You probably don't have that strong of opinions about restaurants. On the other hand, if the beliefs that we're inquiring into are ones that are deeply significant to you both personally and socially, it's going to be a lot harder to seriously consider the possibility that you're wrong. Now, to be clear, being open-minded doesn't mean that you are wrong. It just means that you're willing to change your beliefs if that's where the inquiry takes you. Right? You care more about the inquiry than about being right, right? Or about confirming what it is you already think. Right? That's difficult enough, but even if you are open-minded, what can make open-mindedness even more challenging is another attitude that's needed to sort of be open-minded. You need what's called fair-mindedness. Right? And this is sort of related to the first, and it sort of presupposes that you're already doing the first, but part of the investigating the possibility that you're going to be wrong is going to involve seriously engaging in the views of people who disagree with you. Because obviously you're not by yourself going to be able to figure out why your beliefs are wrong, because if you knew why your beliefs were wrong, you wouldn't have believed them in the first place, right? We need other people, and we need to work with other people to figure out what's right in our beliefs and what's wrong in our beliefs, right? Other people's views will expose us to new arguments and new evidence that we previously hadn't considered. But again, this is really difficult. It's challenging to engage with beliefs you don't agree with. It's hard to have the principle of charity. I wonder if any of you have this experience. This is an experience that I have sometimes. So if I really love something, right? I just finished a goofy example. I just finished the Final Fantasy VII remake. Final Fantasy VII was like my high school experience. So this is a video game for people who don't know, and this was like this formative video game in my high school. A remake of it just came out. I played it. I absolutely loved it. I adored it. And I usually, once I finish something, I read reviews or whatever. And I was getting really annoyed anytime I would read a critical review, a review that was sort of like against the game or was pointing out flaws in the game, even though many of the things that were being pointed out were maybe even legitimate or reasonable. Because I really liked it, I was really reluctant to engage in views that disagreed with that sort of challenged that. Right? And so this is a case where it was challenging for me to be fair-minded, to take seriously things that disagreed with my own perspective. And again, for various sorts of reasons, right? There can be all kinds of reasons why. But to have a really good inquiry into something, you need to engage with things that disagree with you. How are we doing with these first 2 points? These first two, making these basic attitudes, these make sense to people? Anyone have any questions or like any clarification on what I mean by either of them? Do you all have at least an initial sense of why it can be very difficult to maintain these attitudes, right? Even with the best of intentions, it can be very difficult to maintain these two things, particularly when what's being discussed is something important, right? When it matters. Again, if it's something that doesn't super matter, yeah, it's easy to be fair-minded. If it's something that's in any way important to you, that's where fair-mindedness and open-mindedness become a little bit harder. So we're going to call it anything that sort of interferes with maintaining these two attitudes. We're going to call that a bias of some sort. And there's going to be various kinds of biases that we look at and consider in this sort of last unit. So the most obvious kind of bias, the one that we spent the overwhelming majority of the semester talking about for reasons that will hopefully make sense relatively swiftly. There are basically just logical fallacies. Right? Mistakes in our reasoning. Pretty obviously, yeah, if my goal is to have my beliefs formed on the basis of good evidence or good reasons, if I'm engaged in fallacious reasoning, I'm going to think something is good evidence that isn't. Or I'm going to think something gives me good reasons to believe that something is true when they actually don't. Right? And so that's why this class is called Logic and Critical Thinking, right? Because being able to reason well is indeed necessary to arrive at conclusions on the basis of good reasons. If there's problems with my reasoning, obviously the inquiry is going to go wrong. But this isn't enough, and that's why we're actually using this textbook, because this textbook is one of the few things that goes into some of these other factors, and I think it is indeed really important to notice just logical reasoning, that in and of itself in a vacuum is not enough to ensure inquiry goes well. Because we don't just form our beliefs on the basis of abstract reasoning. Other factors are at play too, and so those other factors can cause things to go wrong. And so you frequently will see this. People will be genuinely trying to be logical to make good arguments, and yet, despite earnest effort, things will be going wrong in the conversation. Usually that means something else that is going on, and indeed, almost always, logical fallacies are going to be accompanied by some other kind of bias. And frequently that's why they're successful, right? As we were talking about with some of the fallacies a little bit earlier, some of the fallacies of illusory support, those fallacies don't even have anything to do with the argument, and yet they still work, right? Something else has to be going on such that these things work, right? I mean, if you don't believe me on this point, just here, let's see, I guess here would be my evidence for this claim that I'm making. Has it ever happened that you've pointed out that someone was wrong in their reasoning, that someone was making a mistake in their reasoning, and that didn't seem to matter? Has that ever happened? That despite pointing out their mistake, nothing changed? More is going on than just a mistake in reasoning as a result. Right? There's some other factor that's causing the person to be intransient in the conversation. Right? Or perhaps it's causing you to be intransient when someone has pointed out your mistake. Right? Both of those are indeed equally possible. Again, this isn't just thing that happens to other people. All of these are things that happen to us too. Right? Everyone sort of is at danger or at risk from these biases. Right? So the other kinds of biases we're going to look at are the other kinds of things that go into our belief formation. So we're going to talk about what are called psychological biases, right? We'll talk about social biases, and we'll talk about cognitive biases. It will take a couple days to get through all of this list. Right? Loosely speaking, psychological biases are biases that sort of deal with our sort of affective states, so sort of like our emotional states and various other kinds of things of that sort. Social biases are biases that are the result of kind of social dynamics or group dynamics that emerge. And cognitive biases are biases that are the results of the way human beings process information. So we'll go through all of these in some detail. Today we'll start with just the psychological ones. We might finish, we probably won't. We'll probably need to keep working on the psychological ones a little bit more on Monday, and that'll be fine. Right? We'll just keep going with it. So what I mean by psychological biases, just define it first. Right? These are biases that are present as a result of emotional or affective states. Now, before we go any further, though, I want to make one point really, really clear. Emotions are not bad, and they are not the enemy of logic. This dichotomy that's just rife throughout our culture, where reason and emotion are supposed to be at war with one another, this is nonsense. This is a horrible formulation. I'm sorry, Star Trek fans. I'm a Star Trek fan too, but the whole Spock thing is silly, right? That somehow what it is to be rational is just to be an unemotional computer. This is just silliness. This is a mistake that frequently is just used to shut down various kinds of people and to keep various kinds of people from taking part in conversations. I mean, there's a philosopher, one of the most important philosophers in history, Aristotle. He's the first logician, so it's worth bringing him up. Aristotle actually argues that if you become aware that injustice is occurring around you and that fact does not make you angry, you haven't really realized that injustice is taking place. Okay? Because in precisely what anger should be is the emotion you feel when you recognize injustice, right? It should be an ally to the rational study of injustice, is recognizing and seeing something unfair is happening in the world. Therefore, this angers me. Something needs to be done about it. Right? So emotion in the abstract can indeed be an ally of reason. But there's also a risk that in some cases our emotional reactions can hinder our ability to actually analyze the evidence present in the situation. And that's where we need to be a little bit more careful. That's where sometimes perhaps it'll be necessary to take a little bit of a step back from our immediate emotional reaction to try to first better process the information and then figure out how it is we actually feel about the information. So let's talk about some examples of these psychological biases. So here's the first one. First one is called ideological fixity. And most of these terms come from psychology. That's where most of these terms are coming from. All right. We got a chat question. Let me get it open real fast. So can I give an example versus bad emotional reactions or good emotional reactions? Absolutely. So it's not so much that the emotions themselves are going to be good or bad, right? There's no bad emotions exactly. Or irrational emotions. There are times, though, where emotional reactions can just hinder us from encountering or properly engaging with evidence. So let's talk about that example case that I was sort of looking at too. So let's say here's a scenario where anger is helpful to reason. If I notice someone sort of being, let's do a really basic example of this. Let's see, I'm an elementary school student, so I'm like 8 or something, and I see one of my classmates getting sort of bullied and their lunch money getting taken from them. And for some reason, I'm 8, so I don't even know why. For some reason, it makes me angry. I feel like something wasn't fair there. Something wasn't right there. That recognition, that sort of emotional reaction, is precisely a perfect occasion for me to start investigating why was that action actually unjust and doing something about it. Right? So there, so the emotional recognition, just like, that seems unfair. That makes me, that just seems wrong to me. That's the perfect occasion to begin rationally investigating what actually injustice consists in and what we can do to prevent injustices of that sort. But now, if the same thing, if I get so angry, though, to seeing this instance of bullying, that I just walk up and punch one of the bullies in the face, right? Then all of a sudden, inquiry that's probably not super conducive to inquiry, right? So it's not so much the anger itself; it's the extent to which the anger is the only thing going on with me, right? You know, that expression, seeing red, right? That's, I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever actually gotten angry enough that you actually do see red, but it actually is indeed a thing that can happen, right? You can get so angry that it becomes the only thing you can focus on is your anger. That's not a scenario that's going to lead to investigation or inquiry. Right? So the anger itself is sort of logically neutral. It's the extent to which the anger sort of is in service of investigating the world, or that it hinders investigating the world, that it then becomes sort of problematic. Right? Another example, my wife, just as an example, is that she has a tendency to, her voice has a tendency to sort of crack sometimes when she's talking about something important, right? That's not her being irrational. What her being irrational is her making bad arguments, right? The tendency of her voice to crack is indeed a sign of her being sort of emotionally invested in what she's talking about, but just because you're emotionally invested in what you're talking about, that doesn't make what you're saying either good or bad, right? What matters is, does your emotional investment, is that preventing you from investigating the situation well? So I hope that's a good or helpful reaction to that, response to that chat question. Feel free to follow it up if you'd like, if you have any further questions with it. All right, so the idea of ideological fixity, an ideology is basically a sort of a framework that we use to interpret the world. And ideologies in and of themselves are not bad. And in a lot of ways, it's necessary, right? We need sort of frameworks to help us navigate the world. So here are some examples of some ideologies. Libertarianism is an ideology, right? Libertarianism is the tendency to view the world in terms of sort of minimizing government. And then increasing individual freedoms as a result. Right? So this would be an example of an ideology. Most religious-oriented people who are heavily religious, religions tend to be ideological in this sense. The opposite of a libertarianism kind of ideology, so like socialism, it would again be sort of a kind of ideology. Conservatism is an ideology. Many philosophical systems are ideology. Like lots of things are ideologies. These are sort of these are the key thing is these are sort of like overarching ways of looking at the world. So they're not about any one particular belief. They're about systems of beliefs, sort of ways of forming beliefs in general. And it's not at all problematic or bad when people coming to an inquiry have some ideology that they approach it from. The best conversations I've had in my life are with my best friend, someone I met in graduate school. One of us, and I'm not going to tell you which of us is which, one of us was a conservative Catholic, and the other was not. I will just say it that way. And in graduate school, we literally have probably talked for hundreds of hours, right? Comparing our competing ideologies and describing the world in terms of our competing ideologies. This was incredibly valuable because he disagreed with me and I disagreed with him. So us coming from our own individual frameworks really worked. What could have shut the conversation down entirely, though, is if these ideological frameworks themselves are things that people aren't willing to investigate. So the reason I picked libertarianism as an example here if your answer to every political question is tax cuts, and it doesn't matter what the political question is, even, right? Like, what should we do about the coronavirus? Tax cuts. What should we do about the decline in Social Security funding? Tax cuts. What should we do about poverty? Tax cuts. What should we do about corruption? Tax cuts. If that's just your answer to every single question, you're not going to be inquiring, right? I mean, you've sort of already answered every question you could have before the inquiry could ever begin, right? You need to at least be open to the possibility that maybe, even if tax cuts are in general a fine answer to many problems, that maybe in this particular case they're not. You would need to start over again, call your ideology itself into question, have your ideology itself be something that could be mistaken, or at least mistaken in this particular case. And again, that's not just trying to pick on the libertarian. The same thing could be true from any of these other ideologies as well. And if you already know the question before the question even gets asked, yeah, you're just not going to be really engaging in inquiry in the right way. How are we doing with this? How are we doing with this one? This one making sense to people? People sort of aware of this in your own lives or with conversations with people that you know? Again, when we were talking about sort of appeals to authority, we actually talked about this a little bit. It's always, what's a problematic political bias? One example that I was sort of giving is when political biases potentially are threats to someone's authority, is if you already know what answer they're going to give to a question before you even ask the question, right? I mean, just in general, inquiry presupposes, maybe I don't know the answer to this question, therefore let's look at it. If you already think you know the answer before you even get started, there's just no point in the inquiry then. You're not going to actually be capable of actually investigating anything. All right. Closely related to this one, I think we'll have time to cover one more of these biases today. Closely related to ideological fixity, they actually tend to go together. There's another bias that psychologists call my-side bias. Right? Or my-sideism, it gets called sometimes. This is where people tend to just be way more familiar with with the arguments in favor of what they already believe than the arguments in favor of things that they don't believe. So again, let's just do this with let's get controversial, right? Probably the worst discussion modern Americans tend to be any discussion about abortion. That tends to be the one that goes the worst, the fastest. Maybe this is your own experience, I don't know, but at least this is my experience anyway. This is the conversation that goes the worst, the fastest. And a big part of the reason is that people who are pro-life don't actually seem to actually know what it is that people who are pro-choice actually believe or say, and vice versa. People who are pro-choice don't actually seem to really know what people who are pro-life actually think or say. On the one hand, this is quite understandable, right? I mean, if obviously you believe the evidence that seems most compelling to you, right? If the evidence wasn't the most compelling to you, that wouldn't be your belief. But if you actually want to carry out an inquiry, you actually need to figure out what it is that other people are actually saying, because the danger of this my-side bias is it makes people who disagree with you just seem silly. It makes it seem like other people, if you don't know why other people say what they say, or maybe you're as a result of your my-side bias, you're committing the straw person fallacy and even misrepresenting what it is that they actually do say, right? it will seem to you then as if people have no good reasons or evidence for their beliefs, and so therefore they're just crazy to believe the things that they say. Whereas in fact, almost always people have at least some reason to believe the things that they actually believe. And that's what the inquiry should be investigating. It should be trying to figure out, okay, why do people believe the things that they believe that are so wildly different from me? Do they believe them for good reasons? And if you just assume that they don't, then again, the inquiry is not gonna go anywhere. The inquiry is not gonna get started. All right, still have plenty more of these biases to sort of go through, so we'll end here for today. We can also go over any questions on either of these first two on Monday. So thank you all very much. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll sort of just pick up from here starting on Monday. Have a great one, and I'll unmute if anyone wants to chat a little bit, and also my office hours are just right after this.